You call those shoes? Victor Harper's laughter cut through the glittering hall, bouncing off marble pillars and crystal chandeliers. His guests followed, chuckling as though obedience demanded it. My maid earns enough from me to at least afford leather that isn't held together by prayer. Evelyn Carter froze mid-step, the silver tray trembling faintly in her hands. A row of wine glasses rattled like nervous teeth. Her eyes flicked down. Yes, the shoes were cracked, their laces knotted unevenly where one had snapped months ago. They squeaked faintly on polished floors. She had polished them the best she could that morning, but under the magnifying gaze of the rich, even effort turned to ridicule. She didn't respond. She simply bowed her head, her dark lashes shadowing eyes that glistened, and set the tray down carefully before withdrawing to the kitchen. Her back was straight, her walk measured, though every step felt like glass beneath her soles. The room behind her hummed with laughter, satisfied in its cruelty. The night at Harper Estate glittered with excess. Men in tuxedos clinked crystal glasses filled with imported champagne. Women in gowns dripping with sequins and diamonds gossiped in hushed tones. The grand chandelier, with its hundreds of cut-glass teardrops, seemed to rain light over it all. Victor Harper, towering in his navy suit, was the star. 53, silver hair combed back like armor, his blue eyes gleamed with the pleasure of his own dominance. He was known for ruthless business deals, a man who turned factories into fortunes, who never bent to anyone. To him, staff were shadows, functional but disposable. Evelyn, in her crisp black and white uniform, was just another shadow. Yet there was something about her that unsettled him. The way she carried herself, with a quiet dignity he could neither understand nor mock away, felt like a mirror, though, that showed his own hollowness. In the kitchen, Evelyn leaned against the counter, tray clutched to her chest. Her breath shook. The laughter still rang in her ears. She thought of the children. Always the children. Every paycheck she earned, after bills, after sending what little she could back home, went straight to St. Mary's Orphanage. Shoes had always been last on the list. She had promised Sister Grace new textbooks this month. Her shoes, battered as they were, still worked. The children needed books more than she needed leather. That was the calculation she made, month after month. She whispered to herself, a habit she carried from girlhood prayers. Hold your tongue, Evelyn. Your dignity doesn't depend on their laughter. Meanwhile, upstairs in the study, Victor's guests showered him with praise for his joke. Sharp as ever, Victor, one banker chuckled. Another clapped his shoulder. That's why you always win. You see weakness, and you don't let it slide. Victor smirked, pouring himself another drink. But behind the smirk was an emptiness, one he never confessed. His late wife, Margaret, used to scold him for such cruelty. She'd died 10 years ago, cancer stealing her warmth from his cold house. Since then, laughter at others' expense was the only laughter left in him. Later that night, long after guests had left and chandeliers dimmed, Evelyn slipped out of the estate. The streets were damp from a light rain. She walked the cobbled path in her squeaking shoes, each step echoing like a memory of the laughter. She stopped at the gate of St. Mary's Orphanage. Through the iron bars, she could see the building's crumbling facade, paint peeling from bricks, but lights glowed warmly in the windows. Inside, laughter rang out, the kind not sharpened by malice, but softened by innocence. Evelyn smiled faintly. Tomorrow she would bring the books. Tomorrow she would fee, or get the laughter at Harper Estate. Tomorrow she would remember why these shoes still had miles left in them. But tomorrow held something she did not expect. Victor Harper, restless and unable to sleep, had made a decision. Public opinion mattered to his business, and whispers were growing about his lack of charity. To silence them, he had decided on a grand gesture. He would donate generously to the very orphanage Evelyn poured her heart into. Not out of kindness, not out of love, out of strategy. He had no idea that walking through those worn, weathered doors would strip away his arrogance piece by piece, and it would begin with the very shoes he had mocked. The morning sun spilled across Harper Estate, painting its marble floors gold. Evelyn moved silently through the halls, polishing banisters, straightening curtains, resetting the dining room for the next event. She never complained, not even after long nights. Work for her was a rhythm, steady, quiet, purposeful. But beneath her calm, the wound from last night pulsed. She could still hear Victor Harper's laughter. She could still feel the burn of 50 eyes staring at her shoes as though they defined her worth. In the pantry, she pulled her envelope of savings from beneath a flour tin. Carefully, she slid out a few bills. Money meant for herself, for new shoes, for dignity. Instead, she folded them neatly into a second envelope labeled, "For Sister Grace, for the children." She tucked it into her bag. Her decision was final. Shoes could wait, children could not. Meanwhile, Victor Harper sat in his private breakfast room, flipping through the morning paper. Articles about economic downturns and strikes filled the front page, but his gaze settled on a smaller headline: St. Mary's Orphanage struggles to keep doors open. His jaw tightened. Perfect. A public relations opportunity wrapped in pity. He called his assistant without hesitation. "Arrange a visit," he ordered, sipping his coffee. "Today, I want cameras there. Make sure the press knows Victor Harper saves the children." "Yes, Mr. Harper," the assistant replied. Victor leaned back, satisfied. He had no interest in orphans, but he had great interest in headlines. At St. Mary's, Evelyn arrived just before noon. The orphanage smelled faintly of bread and chalk, the scent of children's lives stitched together with scraps. Peeling walls were covered in handmade drawings, smiling sons, stick-figure families, flowers that bloomed only on paper. "Evelyn!" a chorus of small voices called as children rushed to her, clutching her skirt, tugging at her hands. She crouched, her old shoes creaking as she lowered herself to eye level. Her almond eyes softened as she hugged them, kissed foreheads, listened to their chatter about schoolwork and games. Sister Grace entered the hall, wiping flour from her apron. "You're an angel, Evelyn, always giving, when you have so little yourself." Evelyn smiled faintly. "They deserve more than I can give. These children. They remind me that sacrifice is never wasted." Her gaze flicked to her shoes. The cracks had deepened, water stains from last night's rain spreading across the leather. Still, she straightened her shoulders. "They'll hold," she whispered. By mid-afternoon, sleek black cars pulled up outside the orphanage gates. Out stepped Victor Harper, flanked by photographers, journalists, and aides in pressed suits. His polished shoes clicked arrogantly against the pavement. Sister Grace's expression darkened immediately. She had no love for men who used children as props. But she forced civility, because the orphanage needed help. "Mr. Harper," she said tightly, "welcome to St. Mary's." Victor extended a hand as though granting her an honor. Of course. I couldn't stand idly by while innocent children suffered." His voice boomed for the cameras, practiced and false. The children, sensing the stiffness, huddled behind Evelyn. She stood tall, hands resting protectively on their shoulders. Her eyes met Victor's, and for a fleeting second his smile faltered. He recognized her, the maid, the one with the shoes. Her presence here, in this place of warmth and sacrifice, unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. The cameras followed as Victor toured the orphanage. He gestured broadly, made promises, signed a check. The reporters scribbled down headlines before they'd even left. But in the corner of the hall, something caught his attention. A donation basket sat on a table filled with items: clothes, books, toys. On top of them lay Evelyn's shoes, the old, cracked, worn-down pair he had mocked. Victor froze. His throat tightened. "Miss Carter," Sister Grace's voice broke the silence, speaking to Evelyn but loud enough for all to hear. "Are you sure about this? Those shoes carried you faithfully for years." Evelyn touched them gently, her fingers running over the cracks as if they were sacred lines in scripture. Her voice was steady, soft, yet it carried through the hall. "They carried me through storms, through work, through nights of hunger. They carried me here, to these children. And now they'll carry them too. In spirit. Every step I took in them was for this place. Let them remind the children that even the smallest sacrifices can hold great love." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Journalists leaned forward, pens scratching furiously. Victor Harper's chest tightened. The laughter from last night rang in his ears, now poisoned with shame. The shoes he mocked were her offering of love. He swallowed hard. For the first time in years, his eyes burned with tears. And there, in front of his entourage, cameras, and the very woman he had humiliated, Victor Harper felt the first crack form in the fortress of his pride. It would not be the last. The orphanage hall grew unnaturally still. The children who moments ago had giggled and tugged on Evelyn's hands now stood hushed, their wide eyes darting between her calm figure and the millionaire who had turned pale under the weight of his own shame. Evelyn placed the shoes firmly in the donation basket as though sealing a vow. "They're only leather," she said softly, "but they carried love. That's what matters." Victor's throat constricted. He wanted to speak, but every practiced line, the politician's smile, the businessman's boast, the host's casual arrogance, died before reaching his lips. Cameras flashed. He forced a grin, but it looked brittle, as though one touch could shatter it. The journalists whispered among themselves, scribbling notes. Millionaire mocks Maid's shoes. Maid donates them to orphans. Sacrifice versus excess, a tale of two worlds. The story was writing itself, and not the way Victor had intended. Sister Grace folded her arms, her stern eyes fixed on Victor. "Funny, isn't it?" she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Some mock shoes as worthless, while others see them as a treasure. Perhaps the worth isn't in the leather but in the heart that wore them." Her words were not just for him. They were for the room, for the watching eyes of reporters and children alike. Victor cleared his throat. "Well, sentiment is admirable," he began, his tone faltering, "but children need more than—" "Children need love," Evelyn cut in, her voice calm but unyielding. "They need to know they matter more than laughter at their expense." The words landed like stones. The cameras caught every syllable. Later, as the press dispersed, Victor wandered the orphanage in silence. The children eyed him with suspicion, not the awe he expected. He watched them huddle around Evelyn, tugging her toward the kitchen where Sister Grace was serving soup. Her laughter with them was unforced, warm. Something in him cracked again. He had built empires, bought mansions, collected art, but he had nothing that resembled the joy spilling from that crumbling building. That night, Evelyn stayed late. To help Sister Grace clean, she scrubbed floors, folded blankets, and patched torn clothes. Her new shoes, donated discreetly by Sister Grace from the storeroom, pinched her toes, not yet molded to her steps. As she worked, she hummed softly, a lullaby from her childhood. The children slept in their bunks, their breathing deep and even. Victor Harper, in the back seat of his limousine, couldn't shake the sound of her voice from his memory. Nor could he shake the image of those shoes in the basket, cracked leather gleaming under the orphanage lights. The next day, gossip spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran with it, social media platforms filled with commentary. Victor Harper laughed at his maid's shoes. Maid turns humiliation into hope for orphans. Wealth without compassion is poverty of the soul. Investors called his office, questioning his judgment. Partners pulled back from deals, wary of public backlash. His assistant warned him, "This isn't going away." For the first time in years, Victor felt cornered. But not by business rivals, nor by politics, by his own conscience. He returned to St. Mary's that week, unannounced. This time there were no cameras, no journalists, just him in a tailored suit that suddenly felt like armor too heavy to wear. The children were in the yard, chasing a ball with shrieks of laughter. Evelyn stood nearby, mending a child's sleeve with a needle and thread. She looked up as he approached, her face unreadable. "You came back," she said quietly. Victor nodded. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled. Why was it so hard to say sorry? He, who commanded boardrooms with a glance, couldn't form the simplest confession. Instead, he pulled a thick envelope from his jacket. "For the orphanage," he said. "It should help." Evelyn looked at it, then back at him. "Money helps, but it doesn't heal." The words struck deeper than he expected. His hand trembled slightly as he set the envelope down on the bench. She went back to her sewing, her calm presence dismissing him more effectively than anger ever could. He stood there, awkward, a man who had conquered cities yet could not conquer his own silence. That night, lying awake in his mansion, Victor thought of Margaret, his late wife. She used to walk barefoot in the garden, laughing when he scolded her for dirtying her feet. "Shoes don't matter," she'd say, "but the steps we take in them do." He hadn't thought of that in years. For the first time in a decade, tears slid down his cheeks. The stage was set. His pride had cracked, his conscience stirred. But the storm inside him was only beginning. Because soon, Evelyn would be forced into the very center of his breaking, and his redemption. I was wrong. The words slipped from Victor Harper's lips before he even realized he'd spoken them. They echoed strangely in the quiet chapel of St. Mary's, where he stood one late evening, watching Evelyn light candles before the altar. The orphanage was hushed, children already asleep in their dormitories. Only the glow of wax flames painted warmth across Evelyn's face. She did not turn to him. Her posture remained steady, her back straight, as though the confession had not reached her. Victor swallowed. About the shoes. About you. About everything. His voice cracked, foreign in its softness. I laughed because it was easier than seeing what was real. Finally, Evelyn turned. Her almond eyes fixed on him, calm but piercing. And what was real, Mr. Harper? Victor's chest tightened. He had expected anger, expected scorn. Instead, he was faced with the unbearable weight of her dignity. That you were stronger than I ever was, he whispered. For days he had been restless. His empire was trembling, investors nervous, business rivals circling. But it wasn't the markets that haunted him. It was her. Her shoes in that basket, her word. It was about sacrifice, the way the children clung to her. He had come tonight not as a businessman, not as a millionaire protecting his image, but as a man stripped bare by shame. I don't know how to undo what I did, he admitted. I thought wealth was power. I thought laughter proved strength. But when I saw you, when I saw those children love you with nothing in your hands but worn leather. His voice broke. He covered his face with one trembling hand. God help me, I felt like a beggar in my own mansion. The admission hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Evelyn lowered her gaze, her voice quiet. Humiliation isn't what you gave me, Mr. Harper. You only revealed what was already true. Your laughter said more about you than my shoes. Her words cut without cruelty. She wasn't trying to wound him. She was simply speaking the truth. Victor's knees weakened. For the first time in years, he sank down, not on a throne-like chair, not at the head of a table, but onto the cold stone floor of the chapel. His hands covered his face as sobs tore out of him, uncontrolled, breaking through the walls he had built since Margaret's death. The sound startled Evelyn. She had seen arrogance, cruelty, coldness, but never this, a man unraveling. He wept openly, chest heaving. I don't deserve forgiveness, he gasped. I don't deserve anything. I've mocked, I've trampled, I've wasted everything Margaret tried to teach me. At the mention of his wife, Evelyn's sternness softened. She had heard rumors, the wife lost too soon, the grief buried beneath empire building. She stepped closer, kneeling just enough so her voice could reach him. Forgiveness isn't deserved, it's given. But it must be lived too. You cannot buy it with checks, you must prove it with change. Victor lifted his tear-streaked face, eyes red, lips trembling. Teach me. The chapel was silent except for the flicker of candles. Evelyn studied him, searching for pretense, for some shred of performance. But she saw none. He was undone, broken in the very place he had come to control. At last, Oz, she said quietly, you want to change? Then start with humility. Start with listening. Start by seeing people, not as tools, not as shadows, but as souls. Victor nodded furiously, like a child desperate for instruction. His expensive suit seemed pitiful now, a costume for a man stripped of pride. I will, he whispered. I swear it. When Sister Grace entered moments later, she stopped dead. There was Victor Harper, the untouchable millionaire, kneeling on the chapel floor, his eyes swollen from tears. Lord above, she muttered under her breath. But she said no more. She simply crossed herself and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. The world would soon know. By the next morning, whispers spread through the orphanage staff. By evening, the city buzzed with rumors. Victor Harper had broken down crying in a chapel, begging forgiveness from his maid. Journalists clamored for proof. Business partners shook their heads in disbelief. Some mocked him for weakness. Others cautiously admired the possibility of change. But for Victor, none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in years, he didn't care about headlines. All he could think about was Evelyn's words. You must prove it with change. And so began the unlikeliest of transformations. The millionaire had knelt before his maid, and nothing, neither his empire nor his pride, would ever be the same again. The next Sunday, St. Mary's Orphanage swelled with noise. Children sang in shaky unison. Sister Grace stirred giant pots of stew, and volunteers bustled through narrow hallways with bags of donations. But the biggest stir came when Victor Harper arrived, not in sleek cars with cameras, but on foot, carrying boxes himself. People stared. The millionaire, who once sneered at cracked leather, now stumbled in polished shoes across uneven cobblestones, sweat beading on his temples as he struggled with cart. Tons of food and supplies. "Careful there, sir," one of the older boys teased, half in awe. Victor smiled faintly, breathless. "You're right, these boxes are heavier than I thought." The children giggled, surrounding him like bees to a flower. They were no longer afraid of him. His arrogance had melted into clumsy sincerity. From the doorway, Evelyn watched. Her arms folded across her chest, expression unreadable, though something inside her shifted. She had expected half measures, expected showmanship, but here he was, sweat-stained and humbled, letting children tug at his sleeve. Later that afternoon, as the stew was served, Victor sat at a wooden table eating from a chipped bowl. The broth dripped down his tie and he laughed, not at anyone, but at himself. "I haven't had soup this good in years," he admitted. The children around him slurped happily, eyes wide at the sight of a man they once feared sharing their simple meal. Sister Grace, passing behind him, murmured under her breath, "Miracles never cease." But Evelyn was not convinced so easily. When the children dashed outside to play, she approached him. "You're here because you cried in a chapel," she said bluntly. "But tears fade. Sacrifice lasts." Victor met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Then tell me what to sacrifice." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Your pride, your habits, your hunger for applause. Can you give those up, Mr. Harper?" He hesitated, then whispered, "I can try." That evening, Victor remained after the volunteers left. He insisted on sweeping floors, scrubbing pots, and folding laundry with Sister Grace and Evelyn. His movements were clumsy, unused to labor, but determined. At one point, as he bent to mop a corner of the dining hall, a child darted in and grabbed his hand. "Mr. Harper," the little boy cried, "come play ball." Victor laughed, a real laugh this time, light, unforced. "Maybe after I finish my chores." The boy frowned. "Grown-ups don't do chores here. Only Miss Evelyn does." Victor's chest tightened at that. He glanced at Evelyn, who was wringing out linens with quiet efficiency. For years, he had ignored the invisible labor that held up his world. Now he saw it for what it was, sacrifice disguised as routine. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about the millionaire seen scrubbing orphanage floors. Journalists who came hoping for a scandal instead found a man handing out soup bowls. Public opinion shifted. Investors, once skeptical, leaned in again, but this time Victor waved off their praise. "I don't care about applause," he told his assistant curtly. "Not anymore." But late at night, alone in his mansion, doubt gnawed at him. Could one act of humility erase years of cruelty? Could scrubbing floors cleanse the stain of mocking a woman's dignity? No answer came. Only silence. One evening, after weeks of effort, Victor found himself in the orphanage library, repairing loose shelves. Evelyn entered, arms full of donated books. She paused, watching him struggle with a hammer. "You don't belong here," she said softly. Victor's face fell. "I'm trying." "That's not what I mean." She set the books down. Her voice was gentler now. "You don't belong in guilt forever. Shame won't rebuild this place. Love will. Commitment will." Her words struck him harder than any accusation. For the first time, he felt not judged, but guided. He nodded slowly. "Then I'll commit. To this place. To them. To you." Evelyn blinked, startled. His eyes burned with sincerity, not romance, but something deeper. Gratitude, reverence, a hunger to be worthy. Days turned into weeks. Victor returned again and again, always without cameras, always with his sleeves rolled up. He painted walls, repaired roofs, donated not just money, but his time. The children began to adore him. Sister Grace, once skeptical, began to soften. And Evelyn? She watched carefully, her guarded heart learning to trust. One afternoon, as Victor walked out of the orphanage yard covered in paint, a journalist shouted from across the street, "Mr. Harper, why here? Why this orphanage?" Victor paused. He looked back at Evelyn, standing in the doorway with her patched uniform and steady eyes. Then he answered, "Because someone showed me that real wealth isn't in what we own, it's in what we give." The crowd murmured, cameras clicked, but this time, Victor didn't speak for headlines. He spoke the truth. And Evelyn, for the first time, allowed herself the faintest of smiles. The transformation of St. Mary's Orphanage was swift and astonishing. What once was a crumbling building with peeling paint and leaky roofs now stood freshly repaired, walls glowing with fresh coats of white and blue. New books lined the shelves of the library, playground swings creaked joyfully instead of rusting in silence, and children who once slept two to a bed now curled under new blankets, their laughter echoing like bells through the halls. And at the center of it all, Victor Harper. Neighbors no longer whispered about the millionaire with disdain. They marveled at him, even admired him. But admiration meant little to Victor now. He found his reward not in praise, but in the beaming faces of children tugging his hands, in Sister Grace's approving nods, and, most of all, in Evelyn's watchful gaze. Yet for all the good he was doing, a shadow lingered. The memory of that night at Harper Estate, when laughter had crushed a woman's dignity. And Evelyn had never forgotten it. The moment came sooner than anyone expected. One bright Saturday, Victor invited donors and townsfolk to a community gathering at the orphanage. He wanted them to see the transformation, to encourage them to join the cause. The courtyard filled with people, wealthy patrons in suits, local families in their Sunday best, journalists with cameras. Sister Grace gave a fiery welcome speech, her voice ringing with pride. Children performed songs they had rehearsed for weeks. The audience applauded, moved by the resilience of the orphanage. Then Victor took the stage. His posture was tall, his suit immaculate, but his expression was humbled. "I came here first," he began, "as a man seeking publicity. I wanted cameras, I wanted headlines, but what I found here," his voice faltered, genuine emotion cracking through. "What I found here was love, sacrifice, dignity." The crowd leaned in. Victor turned his gaze to Evelyn, who stood among the children, her hands folded, eyes steady. "I laughed once," he said, his voice trembling. "I laughed at something I should have honored. I mocked a woman's shoes because I thought they meant poverty, but what they carried was wealth beyond anything I ever owned. They carried sacrifice for these children. They carried love. And I—" His breath hitched, his eyes filled. "I was blind." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed furiously. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had braced herself for polished words, for another performance. But this was different. Victor stepped down from the stage, moving to where she stood. Before the entire crowd, donors, journalists, strangers, he lowered himself to his knees. "I am sorry, Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice raw, breaking, "for humiliating you, for mocking what I did not understand. For every moment I treated you as less than human. I was wrong, and I beg for your forgiveness." The courtyard fell silent. The millionaire knelt in the dust, tears streaking his face, his voice trembling with shame. Children clung to Evelyn's skirt, wide-eyed. Sister Grace covered her mouth with her hands. The audience shifted, some whispering, others wiping tears. And Evelyn's heart ached. She had carried the wound for so long she hadn't realized how heavy it was until this moment. She stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone. "Forgiveness is not mine to give alone, Mr. Harper. Every child here has received more love because of your change. If they can forgive, so can I." She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Rise. But remember, respect is not in words. It is in how you live, every day." The crowd erupted into applause, not the polite kind offered to speeches, but the raw, thunderous kind that comes when hearts are moved. Journalists wiped tears as they scribbled furiously. Donors whispered commitments to give more. But for Victor Harper, none of it mattered. He had not spoken for applause. He had spoken because the truth had finally broken free. And Evelyn Carter, once humiliated in silence, now stood honored before them all, her dignity shining brighter than any chandelier in Harper Estate. That night, as the orphanage quieted and the last of the guests departed, Victor lingered in the courtyard. Evelyn joined him, her steps measured, the faint creak of her new shoes echoing softly. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why did your forgiveness matter so much to me?" Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Because deep down, you wanted someone to see more in you than wealth. And deep down, I wanted someone to see more in me than shoes." They shared a silence that was not empty, but full of recognition, of respect, of something unspoken that would never need words. The injustice had been answered, the arrogant had been humbled, and dignity, once trampled, had risen unshakable. The weeks after the public apology became a season of quiet healing. The story of Victor Harper's breakdown spread across newspapers and social media. Millionaire kneels to Maid at Orphanage event. Some mocked it as a publicity stunt, others hailed it as courage, but those who were there, who saw the tears, who felt the weight of his words, knew the truth. And Evelyn? For the first time in years, she walked without carrying the invisible burden of humiliation. The orphanage continued to blossom. New dormitories were built. A small clinic opened on site, offering free care for the children. Scholarships were established for those aging out of the home. Victor poured funds into every corner of the project, but not as a savior, rather as a servant. He began visiting weekly, sitting with the children, reading to them, letting them braid his hair or drag him into games of tag. He learned to laugh again, not the brittle, empty laugh of arrogance, but the genuine kind, born from joy. Evelyn watched this transformation with quiet astonishment. The man who once sneered at her shoes now knelt to tie the shoelaces of orphans. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Evelyn walked the courtyard where children were playing. Her shoes, still plain though newer, crunched on the gravel. She paused, seeing Victor sitting on a bench, a small boy asleep against his chest. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Do you know what he told me before he fell asleep?" Evelyn shook her head. "He said, 'You're like my father now.'" His voice cracked. He glanced down at the boy, eyes wet. "I've built empires, Evelyn, but nothing ever meant this much." Evelyn's gaze softened. "That's because for once you're building something that outlives you." But beneath the joy, Evelyn carried her own quiet grief. She still worked long hours, still endured whispers when walking through the wealthier parts of town. Dignity had returned, yes, but life's hardships never fully vanished. One evening, Victor noticed the fatigue in her face as she helped serve dinner to the children. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you've given enough of yourself, too much maybe. Let me help you, not just them." She blinked, wary. "Help me?" "I want to fund your education, whatever you want to study, nursing, teaching, business. You've sacrificed so much for others. It's time you have something for yourself." Evelyn froze. Her dream of becoming a teacher, the dream she'd buried decades ago, rose like a flame she thought had long gone out. Tears stood in her eyes. "Why would you do that for me?" Victor's answer was simple. "Because you showed me who I could be when no one else dared." Months turned into years. The orphanage thrived, not just because of Victor's money, but because of the community that rallied around it. Donors became volunteers, children grew into leaders, and Evelyn Carter, no longer just a maid, became a teacher. She stood in a classroom of bright-eyed children, chalk in hand, her voice calm but strong. On her desk sat a small pair of scuffed shoes, preserved in a glass case, a reminder of where it all began. As for Victor, he never sought to erase his past. Instead, he wore it like a scar, visible, humbling, but no longer shameful. He continued his work with the orphanage, but he did so in Evelyn's shadow, always recognizing that the true foundation had been laid long before him, in sacrifices he once mocked. The final scene unfolded on a spring afternoon. A reunion was held at the orphanage, bringing back children who had grown and left, now students, workers, even young parents. They filled the courtyard with laughter, stories, gratitude. Evelyn stood watching, her heart swelling with pride. Victor came to stand beside her, hands in his pockets, his eyes misty. "You know," he said quietly. "I used to think wealth meant power. But standing here now, wealth means nothing compared to this." Evelyn nodded, her gaze sweeping over the faces of children who had once known only loss. "Real wealth," she said softly, "is measured in lives touched." They stood in silence then, side by side. Not maid and master, not benefactor and servant, but two souls forever bound by the weight of one moment. A laugh at a pair of shoes, and the forgiveness that turned mockery into redemption. And so the story closed, not with bitterness, but with the quiet triumph of dignity restored, of love multiplied, and of a legacy that could never be erased.